Hi, I'm Julia Mossbridge, and I'm here to present the results of a bunch of analyses of 4 online tests of psi. So as you probably already know, psi is a name for ESP. It includes precognition, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, telepathy, and mediumship. Forced choice experiments have been traditionally extremely tricky to pin down. So the results have been compared to a trickster. In fact, several authors have said maybe there's something going on where we're not supposed to exactly figure out what's going on with psi, especially in these forced choice type results, which seem to skip around. It's also been compared to the idea that there's this no signaling principle because of quantum constraints on signaling over time. Perhaps we can't use psi to signal across space and time in the way that you would want to, given the sufficient evidence for psi abilities. So I previously compared the same sort of trickster-like phenomenon to a Pascal's principle for psi, where you would push down on a fluid in one place and it rises in another place. Like you stress the system in one place and then it shows the stress elsewhere. All of these examples are people researchers of psi trying to understand, especially in forced choice experiments, how to use the data to really get at what's going on in terms of mechanism and how to use it potentially for applications. It seems very tempting. The data are very clear. There's something actually going on. And then the question becomes, how do you pin it down? So what we wanted to present here, my co-authors, Dean Radin and Mark Boccuzzi and I wanted to present a search principle for psi. And this search principle is especially for forced choice experiments, because we already know that free response experiments like remote viewing and precognitive remote viewing show impressive effects. But this is for forced choice experiments that you could do online, because that's where we can get the most data and at the same time have the hardest time pinning things down. So the search principle has 6 elements. So first of all, it's acknowledging that these are small effects. If psi abilities were big effects, we'd be talking about them all the time, the same time we talk about the fact that when you drop a ball, it falls to the ground, right? These are small effects. So let's admit that, which means we're going to have to do some work to pull them out. 2, we are actually early and exploratory on the timeline of understanding psi. And the reason is partly because of taboos that have prevented funding in this area, and partly because we only recently in the last couple of decades had access to the internet where we could start getting experimental subjects on a large scale. So we're actually very early. So let's try to remember that. In terms of accruing data, that's the A in search. What we mean by that is that because these are small effects and we're early and exploratory on the timeline, we need to accrue lots of data. We don't need to stop after we have 45 participants. We need to get more. And I'm speaking to myself as well as everyone else. I'm guilty of violating all these principles. The R would be recognize diversity in approach. In other words, because you have a method that works for you, does not mean that someone else might not develop a method that is sufficient and perhaps superior for the data that they're looking at. And so supporting this kind of diversity in approach, rather than thinking, oh, well, you have to do it this way because it's been done this way, that's the direction we need to go, we believe. Characterize, don't impose. That's the C in search. What that is about is recognizing that if you're trying to track a mysterious, you're a naturalist and you're trying to track a mysterious butterfly that's hard to pin down and hard to cite and hard to understand and moves quickly, the best thing to do is not assume that it must move in a particular place in a particular way. The best thing to do is describe it. And then once you've described it and you understand the way it's shaped and the way it moves, then you hone in on the big results, the things that seem most obvious. And you can hone in on those by using pre-registered confirmatory analyses. That's one way we recommend. So I'm going to show the results of 4 online psi tests done in collaboration with Dean Radin and Mark Boccuzzi at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and at the Windbridge Institute. So there's 3 of them were app-based, an app called Psi Q initially, and then the name was changed to psi cubed, psi 3. We're on that app, we've got unconscious precognition, we've got a test of conscious precognition, and we've got a test of conscious micro-psychokinesis. For that conscious micro-psychokinesis test, we did a pre-registered confirmatory analysis with 2 data batches. So we saw an effect in the first data batch, and then it was big enough we wanted to see if it replicated in the second data batch. In the website-based test, it was of precognitive remote viewing. And again, we did 2 data batches with a pre-registered confirmatory analysis. So first, let's talk about the app, the psi cubed or psi 3 app. It was available for iOS, so for iPhones, from 2017 to 2020. It is currently unavailable, but likely will be available again. Right now, it's being used in some tests in the neurology unit at Baycrest. So we're keeping it offline until those are complete. The random number generator used for all 3 of the games offered here, which were called Heart Quest, Future Feelings, and Hidden Gurus. The random number generator was a pseudo-random number generator XORed with the accelerometer. So it ended up being a very unpredictable random number generator. So again, the 3 games here, unconscious precognition was called Future Feelings, conscious precognition was called Hidden Gurus, conscious MicroPK or micro-psychokinesis is called Heart Quest. And we'll go through these in order so you could see the results of each. So Future Feelings, here's the way it worked. You would see a picture, a photo, and then you had to click the face that matched the image mood. In this case, it would be, you had to choose between sad and happy. It's a butterfly, so right, you're probably going to choose happy, but some of these are a little difficult to place. But all of the pictures and all of the designations of what was correct to designate a picture were taken from Daryl Bem's 2011 retroactive primate experiment. So he allowed us to have all the images and we just reprogrammed them onto the iPhone. After you would pick that, then you would get a word. The adjective displayed after that would be either matching or congruent, like this one, enjoyable, or incongruent. So if this said ugly, that would be considered incongruent. So the score was usually, according to Daryl Bem's method, is usually the response time difference between the congruent and incongruent trials, which we call RT-diff or response time difference. So what we have, I'm just going to, in words, explain the complex effects and then show you a graph that contains these effects. And that'll be sort of the standard of what I do throughout the talk. So first of all, the results oppose Bem's 2011 results significantly. In other words, congruent trials in his experiment usually had faster responses than incongruent trials. We saw the exact opposite effect. But we also saw that there were faster responses to positive images than negative images, and this was a major bias. And so we ended up splitting the data into positive and negative images so we could look at it more carefully. This is part of characterizing rather than imposing. We also saw effects of people who rated themselves as female trending versus male trending. We saw differences in people who rated themselves as having high psi belief versus low psi belief. And in a multiple linear regression, we found that psi belief, gender, extroversion, neuroticism all predicted the interaction term, which the most informative term that we could derive from these data was this interaction term, the response time difference for the positive images minus the response time difference for the negative images. So note that's a lot to pin down. So you can always take a screenshot of that. And let's look at the actual graph. So on the y-axis, we have the mean of the response time difference. So mean of the congruent minus the incongruent response time. And what we have is the black bars are for positive images and the gray bars are for negative images. So you can see overall that for both positive and negative, but significantly so for negative, you have the mean congruent response time minus the incongruent response time is positive there, which is the opposite of what Daryl Bem found. You'll also see an interesting situation here, that interactions. So you can see that for women versus men are people who are more female trending versus male trending. Look at the relationship between positive and negative. It's flipped. So women are going negative for positive images and positive for negative images, and men are going in the same direction for both, although less positive for negative images. The asterisks, by the way, refer to significance versus chance. Okay, look at low psi belief versus high psi belief. You see a similar interaction pattern. That's very intriguing. And this is, you can see why we recognized that this interaction term between the response time difference to the positive and negative was actually the most informative. You could see in the data that that is in fact the situation. So that was very intriguing to us. And just keep in mind these, I'm going back a slide for a second, keep in mind the last point, that psi belief, gender, these personality factors predicted that interaction term. Okay, so now we're going to move on to, oh wait, briefly, I just want to point out what parts of the search principle did we use for psi here? We assumed small effects. We recognized that it was early and exploratory. We accrued data. We recognized the diversity in the approach. Just because it had previously been analyzed one way, we didn't stick with that. We looked at the data so we could understand what worked, and we characterized without imposing. We didn't hone in on any big results because these results were not profoundly big in terms of their statistical significance, so we let that be. So let's move on to conscious precognition. In this experiment, you're giving a, well, not experiment, it's really supposed to be a game, but it's really kind of like an experiment, right? So you're given this spacescape on the app, and you're supposed to predict where a guru will be. If you can see in the middle here, there's a little bit of a flying bird, that's the guru. It's just showing up on the screen. And just before that, the person will have picked where they think it's going to show up. And the score is from a ranked list of possible distances between the point that they picked and the point where the guru showed up. So by the way, we do the score that way so we can avoid the obvious confound of people clicking in the middle, which is the closest point to everywhere on the screen, and getting a high score. So it has to be in a ranked list. There was a little bias that we noticed in the data. So first of all, at the top graph, in terms of where the master or the guru actually showed up, it was equally split along all four quadrants, top, bottom, left, right. But in terms of where people touched, and I showed these data in 2019, but I'm showing them again to make a point, you can see those p-values are different from the above. So in other words, there's a significant difference where people actually touch. They prefer the right, top, and then next the bottom right, and then next the left bottom, and then least of all the top left. So we knew that bias existed, but in this case we ignored it by taking just the score in this ranked list as our dependent variable. We saw simple effects. So first of all, again, we saw that the effects opposed what the presumed conscious intent of the participant was. We saw no gender effects this time, no psi belief effects. We also saw that psi belief, psi confidence, gender openness, and neuroticism predicted the score. So these are relatively simple effects. And we are thinking that that may be because we are absolutely looking at exactly the score that we showed the user, but that is the least biased score to use. So that's why we did it. So you can see here the significant expectation of opposing effect is negative. So in every case, whether you take everyone together, women, men, or female trending, male trending, low psi belief or high psi belief, you'll see this as a negative score, and it's significant overall, but not in some kind of major way. So what did we look at here? We used the idea of small effects, early and exploratory, and accruing data. So that's it for that one. That was not that exciting, but it was, at least it confirmed this idea that effects often oppose our expectations. Conscious MicroPK, this is the heart quest and the last of the 3 games or experiments on the Psi3 app. So what you do here is you touch the screen to make the robot's heart glow. If you have the sound on, it'll also make a tingly sound. And it can glow either a little bit or a lot or not at all. And that is based on the score. So the score is calculated based on the relationship between the trial and reference bits. Let me explain what trial and reference bits are. So when you start the game, reference bits get calculated from the random number generator, And there's two of them. So in this case, at the bottom of the screen, you could see I've decided that the reference bits were 0, 1. Okay, so there's just two of them. It's either 0 or a 1 in each position. On every trial, new reference bits get calculated. In other words, after the person presses the screen, new reference bits are calculated from the random number generator. So you can see here on the first trial, trial bits are 0, 0. Second trial bits are 0, 1. Third trial, it's 1, 1. And fourth trial, it's 1, 0. These are all compared to the reference bits, which remain the same throughout the game. So you could get a score of 1 if one of those bits matches. You could get a score of 2 if both of them match, and a score of 0 if neither of them match. And that's what indicates 1, 2, or 0. That's what indicates whether the heart will glow and whether the app will sing. If it's 0, nothing happens. If it's 1, there's a little bit. If it's 2, it's like, wee. So that's the task. This one was super interesting. So first of all, no effect for the score that we showed the participants, and nothing going on with trial bits, and yet a huge effect for reference bits. In other words, we thought people would be trying to match reference and trial bits to increase their score. What happened was, apparently, people were changing the proportion of zeros in the reference bits to try to change their score. Not what we thought and not what we told them the task was about, but that's what happened. And the app uses the same exact function to create the reference and the trial bits. And so we cannot blame it on that function because they showed very different effects. There was a big gender effect for reference bits. And we ended up with a dependent variable that was the first reference bit minus the second reference bit. And psi belief, age, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, all predicted that interaction. So we did a pre-registered confirmatory analysis, and that confirmed the reference bit effect and the gender difference. Although in one sense, the gender difference opposed the pre-registered analysis, and in a different sense, it replicated it, and I will explain. So here's the data batch 1, in which we first saw the reference bit effect. Here we have a proportion of zeros in each reference bit on the y-axis, and then we have all trials. So this is a trial level analysis of all trials from women and trials from men. So again, the software function that creates the reference bits and the trial bits is exactly the same. It's just called at different times. And so the fact that this line at 0.5, which represents chance, is not exceeded by the trial bits, but is definitely exceeded significantly by the reference bits for both the first and second reference bits overall, suggests that there's some micro-psychokinesis going on in that area. So look at the trials for women and the trials for men. It looks like trials from women are having a huge effect. In other words, women are really pulling this micro-psychokinesis effect, and men are barely pulling it, and it's only in the first reference bit that they're pulling it. So let's go to data batch 2. So we registered an analysis, we pre-registered this analysis, and then we looked at these data. And again, we have the same effect. Reference bits overall, both reference bit 1 and 2, we see significantly more zeros than chance, but the trial bits, nope. We look at trials for women. Let's look at the previous data batch for a second. Same situation. First reference bit has a lower value of proportion zeros than the second reference bit, but they're both above chance. But let's look at data batch 1 again. For men, we just had a measly effect there, and it was only in the first reference bit. Here, we have a big effect. It is still greater in the first reference bit. So the question is, what do you want to call the pattern? And this comes to trying to characterize things. In the pre-registration, we called the fact that women were seemed to be significantly producing more zeros in either reference bit than men, and especially the second reference bit. We called that the effect. And that did not replicate. But what did replicate was this pattern of the interaction. So that reminds us of that it's really important to accrue more data, really important to recognize the diversity in the approach, to characterize, not impose, and then hone in on the big results. What replicates, what doesn't, and what actually is the effect. sometimes you're not right about choosing the effect the first time, right? So then you go, okay, well, what about this? Keep going. Okay, so we talked about the first 3 online psi tests, which are all forced choice. The last online psi test is also forced choice, but it's based on a precognitive remote viewing task. This is a website-based task with significantly fewer unique logins, but they were very committed. This is a 1 trial task, and it was based on, I wrote this book with Teresa Chung called The Premonition Code, and it was based on the idea of using the book to bring people to this website so that they could do this experiment. And the way it works is it has 6 steps. I'm not going to show all 6, but it brings people through a single trial called controlled precognition, which is really precognitive remote viewing. What you're trying to do is get information about a future image before that image is shown to you. And it takes you through these steps: physical preparation, practical preparation, mental preparation, making sure you write everything down, doing scans. It's a long process. The actual user of the website does not have to do this process. They could click through these buttons by pressing the word future multiple times. It will take them a few seconds to get to the actual task that records their response. That's this one. Most people, however, did not. They actually did a lot of what we asked them to do, as far as we could tell, in terms of the time it took for them to start and then to get to this page. So this task says your next step is to experience the target. So what happens is 2 images are being chosen from a database of images, and they are designed to be pairs that are mutually exclusive in terms of what they contain. And these are the graphs representing what they contain. What we're trying not to do here is show people the images, because what can happen is that when you show people the images and you say, which was your remote viewing session most like, people can get aspects of both images because they're looking at the images, even though they're not really the target yet. So we're trying to get around that by showing these graphs and saying, which graph represents the contents of what you think is in the target based on your remote viewing session. So you can see that on the left, we have vegetation and or food, hills, mountains and or rocks, water, fluids, animals, humans and their likeness. And on the right, we have words, symbols, and or ideas. So these are the choices. It's either going to be just words, symbols, or ideas, or it's going to be some kind of nature scene. And we don't know which yet, and the random number generator also doesn't know which yet. The person has to choose. After the person chooses, there's no way to go back. Triggers the random number generator, which in this case is based on network traffic, to choose one of those 2 targets. It turns out it was this little one with, I don't know if you can see this little jellyfish there, but that's the living being, and in the water with the rocks. So you're either correct or incorrect. And at the base of the screen, it says, remember to send loving feelings back to yourself while you were working. I actually added that in there because it turns out from a different set of experiments, I think I spoke about these last, in 2019, that feeling unconditional love seems to be able to support your ability to do this precognitive remote viewing task, at least in preliminary experiments. So working on that now, thanks to a grant from the Vial Foundation. So what do we have? So first of all, we have complex effects. So overall effects are opposing the presumed conscious intent, which is to be correct. We also have time course effects, sex at birth effects, and a pre-registered confirmatory analysis that actually confirms that the interestingness of the target is related to accuracy. The more interesting targets, people are more accurate at doing that. So let's go through the data. Let's look at the first 5 trials. So these are data from everyone who did at least 5 trials. Looking at 2 different data batches, we see the blue line is the first batch, and the dotted or the dashed green line is in the second batch. And you could see the mean proportion correct on the y-axis. The 0.5 red line is chance, so you're 50% chance of getting it right. The interesting thing here to me is that on trial 3 for both the first and the second batch is the time when people were more likely to get this correct. Now, this doesn't control for how long it was between their trials. It could be all on the same day. It could be, 10 weeks apart, right? I mean, we really don't know, right? This is everyone's 3rd trial. But it reminds me that on the first trial, you're either getting it correct or incorrect. The second trial, you're having an emotional response to that, whatever it was. And then the third trial, I think you're more likely to be kind of letting go. So that's my interpretation. Who knows? Interesting to see if that replicates. Session duration effects. So we were very curious. The time that it took between pressing the start button and going through all those 6 steps to choosing one of those graphs, we were wondering if that had any impact on how people's performance moved or changed over time. So let's look here at about, in the first batch, we have the blue. I'm sorry, the first batch is the blue in terms of proportion correct on the y-axis. The second batch is this dashed green line again. 50% correct is chance. So this doesn't replicate. So in the first batch, they're doing better than chance, right between 5 and 8 minutes. And on the second batch, they're doing significantly worse than chance. So that's kind of probably spurious. The thing that's very interesting is for both batches, right between 20 and 25 minutes session duration, they were worse than any other time. Now that's just quantitative in the first batch, and that's significantly worse than chance in the second batch. So, and in fact, you can see here that performance in the second batch was generally worse than chance. What's interesting about that to me is that there's an attentional shift around 15, 20, 25 minutes that people talk about in learning, in medical students, in all sorts of contexts where you're trying to get people to pay attention in naturalistic settings. There's an attentional shift around that time. And it just makes me wonder if when you stop a session right at the time your attention is shifting, and then you choose which of these 2 graphs that those data match with, that the session data match with, it might be an attentional flip that actually doesn't serve you. So again, that needs more understanding. The sex at birth effects were super interesting, and it suggests that women are in fact using micro-psychokinesis to make themselves worse. Okay, great. So we have females. I'm calling them females because they said their sex at birth was female, and the ones who I'm calling males, they said their sex at birth was male. So that's how that's going. We have 3 columns here: the grand mean proportion correct, the grand mean for the targets that were selected, and the grand mean for the targets that were presented. Let me explain the difference, but first show that first effect. Women across the board, regardless of what was selected and was presented, are performing significantly worse than men, and they're performing significantly worse than chance. Okay, so let's go to selected versus presented so you can understand this difference. Selected means the software is actually selecting one of these 2 positions for the graph for the image that will be presented. So remember, we have, task reminder, we have these 2 graphs, right? And the software, after people are selecting A or B, the software is selecting an image that is represented by this or this, right? So people generally want to select the first position, whether it's on the top of their screen or on the left, they want to select the first position. So this is the proportion of people who actually selected the second position in this graph, because I had to choose one of those positions because of the bias. So look at the second position. Women are significantly less likely than chance to select the second position. Men are also, but less impressively, also less likely than chance to choose the second position. What does the software do? For women, it's choosing the actual, what it should be doing. It's producing this nice split between first and second position, right? That's the actual software presentation of the targets. What is it doing for men? It's actually choosing the second position less. In other words, so you can interpret this either way. So women are either making things worse by making the software behave in a non-biased way, or men are making things better for themselves by having the software behave according to their bias. Either way, interesting interactions with sex at birth and their performance here, especially related to what they're choosing versus what the software is choosing. Just another task reminder for this next section on interestingness, it's really important to get it that this is a binary choice. And at the same time, you do see this information on the screen. You just don't know which of these is going to be the target. Okay, so we did an interestingness analysis because people have said that in remote viewing, the numinosity or the interestingness, which aren't necessarily the same thing, but in this particular conversation, I'm just going to conflate them, actually support accuracy. So more interesting targets are actually easier to describe for a remote viewer. So I wanted to test this out, or we wanted to test this out. And if you look at the y-axis, what we have here is the proportion of the targets presented to a bunch of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers that were rated interesting for these two situations. Dark blue is the trials that were correct. And blue outline or white bars, the trials that were incorrect. These aren't all trials, by the way. I actually took the top 8 targets that were most likely to be correct and the top 8 targets that were most likely to be incorrect so that we could look at consistent data. So there are certain targets that people kept getting right and certain targets that people kept getting wrong. These were all presented in that second position. Again, the unbiased place to look for these results. So what you can see is when you take all data together, the proportion of the ones that were correct, more likely to be correct, are rated significantly more interesting by these judges who had no idea about the experiment. They were just looking at pictures and rating them, than the ones that were incorrect, more likely to be incorrect. Let's take out the words, because if you look at this, this just looks less, I don't want to pick this one. I want to pick this one. There's more stuff going on and it's more likely to match my session. So people will have a bias there. It's not actually going to match the bias of the software, and it doesn't, but I just checked out, what if we just took out the words? You see the same effect, but it's not significant. Take out, look at only targets without subjects. People think subjects or animals, humans are more interesting than non-animals, humans. You still see the effect. You narrow it down to one element. So it's a one element graph compared to another one element graph, and you still see the effect. So we pre-registered these analyses with the Kessler registration unit, and we did it again on a second batch of data. And here, because there were fewer people in the second batch, I had to go with the top 5 correct and top 5 incorrect. But again, you see the same effect here. It's significant with words, no subjects, one element. So that's an example of using all of these. So we started with these small effects, these time course effects, and awareness that it was early and exploratory. We accrued data. We recognized that the way we were looking at the data might not be the way that's the most useful way to look at the data. When we started thinking about interestingness, then we characterized the interestingness without imposing. Right? We didn't decide that there's one way to look at interestingness. We just asked a bunch of M-Turkers to describe, to rank the targets by interestingness. And we honed in on the big result. So what do we conclude from all this? So first of all, nothing new, but expectation opposing effects, which some people call psi missing. But in this case, there's plenty of psi going on. It's just opposing the expectations of people, and including the experimenters. Expectation opposing effects are rampant. Big effects seem generally to be consistent, at least in this case. When you ask people to do a task, that does not predict the mechanism that they're using to do the task. So for example, when people were doing the precognition task, turns out either women or men or both, depending on how you think about it, were using MicroPK, right? Or at least there's evidence for at least some MicroPK. So what you ask them to do and what they do is very different. And basically, we just want to reinforce that these search principles actually seem to work. And I wanted to show this picture of the folks in the movie Arrival. These are 2 scientists who are trying to understand what those weird hand-like creatures are, the heptapods floating in a vast milky sea of goo. They're trying to understand how they communicate. And what they recognize is that their communication is extremely contextual in that each of these blobs that you see on this circle are related to the other blobs and contextual in time. So the areas of the circle are all being presented at once, even though it's an ordered concept, like you would have a human sentence in time, everything's being presented at once, and yet everything depends on everything else. This is kind of the way I'm seeing psi now, is we really are starting to hone in on the impressive contextuality of psi. And maybe we need to not be so surprised, or maybe I need not to be so surprised that it's not so easy to track down. It's like a completely different language. And we are just starting to learn it, especially at the level of forced choice versions of these kinds of phenomena. So I just want to thank all the participants in the experiments, all the folks who volunteered for the PsiCube hackations, Teresa Chung, my co-author on the premonition code, the IONS research team, the designers and coders of the Psi3 app, Greg Travis, David Nix, Arna Delorme, Cameron Bamer, and Mikey Siegel, Hibsco Limited, who supports the website, as well as Woodbridge Institute, but of course, Mark is actually a co-author, so I don't know how to put that in here. The All Foundation funders for Dean and myself, Jeff and Leslie Olsner, Charlie and Maureen Pelton, the Hummingbird Foundation, and of course, my co-authors and their institutions. So Mark Boccuzzi from the Woodbridge Institute, Dean Radin from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and all of my institutions as well, University of San Diego, the Institute for Love and Time, and the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So thank you, everybody. I so appreciate it. Stick around. Mark and Dean will join me for questions and answers.